What's up, y'all? Roy here, and you're listening to the Clemenz with Z podcast. So, this episode is another part of the ongoing series I've been doing called This Was Supposed to Be the Place. A phrase that really captures how a lot of us feel about the churches that we once trusted. Places that promised belonging, purpose, and healing, but ended up breaking us or turning us into something we didn't recognize anymore. But right now, inside that bigger series, I've been following this thread kind of series within a series. It was about idolatry. So last episode in this was supposed to be the place. I talked about how we idolized the church itself. The institution became sacred. We clung to the belief that this one specific church, ours, was the only true way to be close to God. We weren't just defending faith, we were defending the brand, the logo, the building, the culture. But this week I want to take it a step further. Because if last week was about idolizing the place, this week is about idolizing the man. In the ICOC, that man was Kip McKean. And I gotta say, even as a kid, I knew he was important. Nobody sat me down and said, worship Kip, because that's not how it worked. It, but you felt it, the way his name carried weight, the way people talked about him, the way leaders quoted him more than they quoted Jesus, the way every man I looked up to kind of started to sound just like him. I can even remember as a kid, there was one, I think some Sunday Devo that Kip had spoke or something or had the sermon, and I can remember telling my dad that, I think, I want Kip McKean to baptize me, you know, like that's how important he was, because he was the founder, the visionary, the guy who started it all. But over time, something in me started to shift. 'Cause I thought we were worshiping God, but it really started to feel like we were worshiping Kip. And once you see that, once you see how the language, the tone, even the culture is built around one man, it's really hard to unsee. And it's not just influence, it's not just admiration, it's something deeper. And it didn't stop with him, because once I saw it in our church, I started to see it in other churches, other pastors, other pulpits, other brands built on the man behind the mic. So today, that's where we're going. We're going to talk about pastor worship, cult of personality, how churches start looking more like empires than communities, and what happens to our faith when a man becomes the message. And honestly, I don't know if any of us should really be surprised that this stuff happens. Maybe the reason this all feels so normal, this kind of leader worship in the church, was because we really have already been doing this. I've been doing this my whole life. Like, long before I ever stepped into a Bible study or listened to a sermon about obedience or discipleship or following Jesus, I was already learning how to follow someone, how to center someone, how to build part of who I was around this person that I admired. I mean, as a kid, there were a couple of people. First, I idolized the baseball player Frank Thomas. Yeah, the big hurt. He played for the White Sox in the 90s, and this dude was a machine. To me, he wasn't just a great player, he was the player. There was this stretch of middle school where I was rarely seen without a White Sox hat or shirt or jersey. I can remember getting one for Christmas and being so psyched about it. And I loved the way he played, the way he stood at a plate. I wanted to swing like him, be like him. And then in high school, things took a turn. And by a turn, I mean Pauly Shore. I know, I know. It's true. Because I was obsessed. Judge me or whatever, I don't care. I watched every single movie that Pauly Shore made. Encino Man, Son-in-Law, In the Army Now, Biodome. I thought he was the funniest, coolest, most out there dude alive. I wanted to dress like him, talk like him, and be like him. You know, I watched Encino Man so many times that my dad literally had to ban me from renting it again at Blockbuster. He was like, "Pick a new movie. You've watched this one too many times." And again, this kind of wasn't just entertainment. It was kind of something different. It was identity. It was devotion. It was idolatry. I didn't have that word for it back then. I just knew there were people I admired so much that I wanted to become like them. And so when I got older, and when I entered church spaces where the goal seemed to be emulating the leader, absorbing his language, and imitating his vibe, it really didn't feel all that weird because I had been training for this since childhood. And the thing is, I don't think I was alone in that. Most of us, whether we realize it or not, grew up learning how to center our lives around someone. We're shaped by who we admire, who we follow, who we think has it, you know? And whether it's a baseball player, movie star, or megachurch pastor, the instinct is still the same. We start to orbit around someone else's gravity. We start to borrow their voice, their language, their identity. And we call it loyalty or inspiration or leadership. But underneath it all, it's something much older, much more familiar, something the Bible talks about over and over again. It's idolatry. And it's not the kind with golden calves and ancient rituals, but the kind that shows up in boardrooms and pulpits, in the way we protect platforms, excuse abuse, and elevate men, and lose ourselves. And Scripture saw this coming from miles away. You know, I know when we think about idolatry, we think about golden calves, carved statues, and ancient rituals. But it's not just some old school sin from the Old Testament. It's right here, it's now, it's subtle, it's seductive, and honestly, it's everywhere. Scripture talks about idolatry a lot, not because people couldn't stop making statues, but because people couldn't stop replacing God with something they could control, something they could see, something they could manage. In Exodus 20, the command is clear: You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath. And yet, just a few chapters later, while Moses is still on the mountain, the people melt their gold and make a calf. And they say, "This is the God who brought us out of Egypt." It's not that they didn't believe in God, it's that they wanted something more tangible, something they could point to, something impressive, some, something they could worship on their own terms. And we do the same thing today. Only now, the golden calf has a mic and a sermon series. And in Romans 1:25, Paul says that people exchange the truth of God for a lie and worship created things rather than the creator. And that hits different when you think about how we elevate pastors, movements, and leaders, not because they are God, but because they represent something we want: certainty, power, a voice we can follow without question. And even Colossians 3 calls greed idolatry, because idolatry isn't just worshiping a thing, it's about what we center, what we protect, and what we refuse to question. And maybe the hardest part to admit is that sometimes the most dangerous idols are the ones that we dress up in spiritual language, the ones we defend because they preach the truth, the ones we follow because God's clearly blessing the church, or the ones we excuse because everyone has flaws. But just like in Isaiah 44, where the prophet mocks a man who carves an idol from the same wood he used to cook dinner, sometimes our idols look ridiculous when we finally name them. We build them, we worship them, we burn out trying to be like them, and all the while, we think we're being faithful, but we've just made a man the center. And it doesn't matter if it's made of wood, gold, or charisma, because it's still idolatry. And I saw all of that up close. Because in the ICOC, we didn't just build a church, we built a culture around one man. And that's where this part of the story really begins for me. Because when I look back at the church, specifically Kip, it's easy to see how we got here. I mean, now that I've read the articles, listened to interviews, and heard dozens of stories on this podcast, it's clear. Kip was incredibly charismatic, powerful, magnetic even. The church grew fast, and a lot of that growth can be traced to how he structured things, how he led, and how he trained other leaders. You hear stories from the 70s and the 80s where some little church would have a few hundred people, and then Kip, or someone trained by Kip, would come in, and suddenly that church would explode. A few hundred people would turn into 1,000. And that kind of growth, that kind of energy, oh, that gets people's attention. It felt like something big was happening, something divine. And I think that's why people got behind him. That's why they trusted him, because they saw the results. I never really met him personally, but I didn't need to. You could feel it. Just watching him preach, whether live or later in a KNN video, there was this intensity. He had this presence. He could command a room, and it's like you wanted to listen. You felt like if you just followed the plan, trusted his vision, you'd be part of something world changing. And we usually get behind people like that, right? Especially in church. Someone with vision, someone with confidence and momentum. It makes us feel safe. It's like we're in good hands. But here's the thing that I didn't see, and maybe none of us really saw it, because it stopped being about God's vision. It stopped being about community or shared purpose. Slowly, it became his ideas, his story, his version of the church. And whether we knew it or not, we weren't just following Jesus. We weren't just part of a church. We were adjusting our lives around one man's belief system. We were idolizing a man and calling it faith. And it's wild because when you look at it on the surface, it looks spiritual. It all looked like we were building the kingdom. But underneath it, it was about control, loyalty, branding, obedience to a vision that was less about the gospel and more about Kip's version of the gospel. And once you realize it, it's hard to unsee, because you really start to notice how everything flowed from him: his voice, his language, and his tone. And the people who rose up in leadership, they were the ones who could mirror him the best. And the people who rose up in leadership, it was the mirror. And that's what it came down to. They didn't necessarily have the most humility, wisdom, or spiritual depth, but they had the tone, they had the posture, they led Bible studies the way he did, they preached the way he did, they talked like he did, they quoted him, and they said it in just the right cadence. And we weren't just learning about how to follow Jesus, we were learning how to be Kip. And I even saw it as a kid in these devotionals. I don't think I had the language for it back then, but I could feel it. There were certain guys and girls who were celebrated, lifted up, praised, and it wasn't just because they were faithful or kind. It was because they were bold, commanding, charismatic. They had the quote unquote Kip energy. And in campus ministry, it got even clearer. You could tell who was being groomed for leadership, who got more time with the evangelist, who was seen as the next up. And it always seemed to be the guys who could channel him the best, the ones who could mimic his confidence, his intensity, and his language. The guys who knew how to push people hard, because that's what Kip did. It became the culture, not just an individual style, but the blueprint for what leadership was supposed to look like. Once that's the standard, everyone starts trying to fit the mold. Because if you want to be trusted, if you want to be respected, if you want to be quote unquote used by God, You learn to sound like him. And I get it now. I see what was happening. We weren't building a church, we were replicating a man over and over again. And honestly, I wish I could say it just stopped there. I wish I could say that it was just an us thing, an ICOC thing. That we had this one guy and got caught up kind of story. But the more I've looked around, the more I've listened, watched, and paid attention, the more I realize it wasn't just our church. It's kind of everywhere. Different names, different branding, different sound systems, but the same patterns, the same platform, the same gravitational pull around the man. Because somewhere along the way, a lot of churches stopped being communities of faith and started becoming reflections of whoever's holding the mic. And I want to talk about it. I want to talk about churches that rise and fall in the charisma of their pastors. I want to talk about pastor worship, the cult of personalities. Because if we don't name it and don't talk about it, we're going to just keep repeating it. And so here's what I've been noticing more and more. A church starts off as a group of people, a community, a mission, a shared sense of faith and purpose. But then slowly, subtly, the focus always shifts. And before you know it, the church isn't about people anymore, it's about the pastor. Not officially, of course. Nobody really announces it from the stage, but you can feel it. And one of the clearest signs it's happening is when everyone starts to, look the same. Not just in what they believe, but in how they dress, how they talk, what they post, what they prioritize. Because people don't just follow the teaching, they start aligning themselves with the character and the vibe of the guy on stage. If the pastor is cool and hip, fashion forward, suddenly the whole church starts looking like an influencer convention. If the pastor's ripped and a CrossFit dude who posts shirtless pics, I should take that out. I don't think they're posting shirtless pics if they're a pastor. But the pics I'm talking about. And sermon clips in the same swipe. Well, don't be surprised when his staff and followers start hitting the gym a little bit harder. If the pastor has this gruff alpha tone and preaches with authority, then all the other men start mirroring that too. It's really all like attracting like. And I get it. Some of it's natural. We're drawn to people we admire. We imitate the people we respect. But in these spaces, it doesn't just stop at influence, it does become replication. People stop becoming better versions of themselves and start becoming carbon copies of the man on stage. The same voice, same tone, same shoes, same theology. And it creates this unspoken pressure. If you want to belong here, you have to reflect him. If you want to lead here, then you have to become him. And before long, what was once a church becomes more like a personality cult with small group options. And it's no longer about transformation, it's about imitation. And it doesn't look like Christ, it looks like the brand of one man. And I get it. I get why people get caught up in it. Charisma is powerful, certainty is comforting. And when someone seems to have all the answers, it's easier to follow them than to wrestle with God on your own. And I'm not above this either. I still catch myself doing it. There was a stretch when I realized I was only going to a couple of voices. For me, it was people like Rob Bell and Richard Rohr. I admire them deeply. Their teachings help me unravel and rebuild so much of my faith. But over time, I noticed something. I wasn't just learning from them. I was kind of depending on them. They became my go-to voices for everything. And that's not necessarily wrong, but it is risky because no one should have that much influence over your soul, even the ones who've helped you the most. So now I try to be more intentional. Yes, I still read Richard Rohr and Rob Bell books and listen to podcasts and all of that, but I also make sure that I'm learning from different voices, different perspectives, different backgrounds. Not because I don't trust them anymore, but because I've seen what happens when you build your world around just one voice. And when it happens in church, when everyone is being shaped by just one man, one personality, one way of seeing the world, that's when it gets dangerous. Because when the entire church starts revolving around the one man, the entire church becomes vulnerable to the one man's failures. When his voice becomes the voice, when his preferences become the culture, when his image becomes the standard, then the moment he falls, whether it's through scandal, burnout, or just being human, the whole thing starts to crack. And we've seen it, not just in my church, but everywhere. And so, what happens when we build an entire church around a man instead of a mission? When the charisma of the leader becomes more important than the character of the community? When the man becomes the message and everything starts to bend around him? The sermons start to sound like TED Talks. The language of the church slowly becomes his language. The priorities, the vibe, the theology, it all starts to reflect his preferences, not necessarily the heart of God. And at first, it might look like it's working. The church is growing, the lights are bright, the branding is tight, and the Instagram reels are fire. But eventually, the cracks start to show because when everything is built on one man, it only takes one fall to bring the whole thing down. And we've seen it over and over again. We saw it at Mars Hill with Mark Driscoll. He built a church empire on charisma, control, and a brand of Christianity that glorified aggression, especially his own. His sermons were loud, confrontational, and often demeaning, particularly toward women. And the culture reflected that. The people who rose up were the ones who mirrored him the best. And when all of it collapsed, people weren't just mourning the end of a church. They were grieving the loss of what they thought was a movement of God, but in the end it had been built around Mark. We saw it also with Ravi Zacharias, a brilliant apologist, revered by millions. But after his death, the truth came out. Years of sexual abuse, manipulation, and systemic cover-up. It wasn't just heartbreaking, it was disorienting. Because when you build someone that high, it makes the fall feel like betrayal. People didn't just lose a teacher, they lost trust in their faith systems. All the warning signs were there, they were just hidden under layers of respectability and status. Same thing with Kip, the abuse, with money, with people. It was there. And then there's Carl Lentz, the face of Hillsong, NYC, the cool pastor who baptized celebrities, wore designer clothes, and brought church to the runway. But behind the image was a toxic culture. When he was fired for moral failings, it opened the floodgates. Stories of control, manipulation, and branding over substance. It wasn't just about God anymore, it was about the aesthetic of God. James McDonald, he ran Harvest Bible Chapel like a spiritual Fortune 500 company until reports of financial abuse and bullying came to light. He was fired, but by then the damage had been done. People had invested money, time, and trust, and they were left wondering if any of this was real. And there's Bill Hybels. He built Willow Creek into one of the most influential churches in America. But even he wasn't immune. Allegations of sexual misconduct and the church's initial instinct to protect him showed that even in successful churches, they were still prone to protect the brand over the people. Again, it was never about the message, it was about the man. And honestly, we can't act surprised. When we hand someone a throne, when we give them control over our spiritual formation, when their voices become louder than the Spirit's, what did we think would happen? Because when the leader is the culture and that leader falls, so does the culture. And I think that's what hurts the most. Not just that these men fell, not just that Kip fell, but the systems and the communities around them were built to protect their power rather than their care for the people. And that kind of structure doesn't fall apart by accident, because it was never built right in the first place. And this is the part that really messes with me. Because this worship of the man, the platform, the brand, this wasn't what church was supposed to be. It wasn't supposed to be about one guy with a mic and a spotlight, building his own little empire while the rest of us tried to keep up. It was supposed to be different. And really, I think that's what breaks my heart the most. Not just the scandals or the abuse, it's the loss of what church could have been. Because I still believe in the idea of a church and a community, not the performance or the brand, but the real thing, the messy, beautiful, sacred thing. A community, a table, a space where no one's the center because everyone is seen, where no one voice drowns out the rest, where leadership doesn't mean being the man, it means creating space for others to grow. And I know I'm just one person, but I've started to kind of dream again what church could be, at least in my own small corner of the world. I don't want a stage or a circle. It'd be awesome to have a church that doesn't need one man to hold it all together because it's being held together by love, not charisma, by honesty, by shared leadership, by people who are actually listening to the Spirit and not just recycling someone else's language. And I want to talk about that. So let's talk about what I think church was meant to be and maybe what it could still be. So, if we're going to talk about what church wasn't supposed to be, which I've been doing, so let's talk about what it was meant to be, or at least what it could be. What might still be possible if we're willing to reimagine something different. And for me, it starts with Jesus. Because when I look at Jesus in the Gospels, not the one wrapped in lights and stage fog, but the real one, or quote unquote real one, I don't see someone building a platform. I don't see authors creating a man obsessed with this being the center of attention. I don't see a guy who needed to the crowd to keep growing. I see someone who walked away from the spotlight, who spoke in riddles and parables and not slogans, who didn't hand out dogma but invited people into mystery, who pointed people back to God, back to themselves, their hearts, and not to himself. He also frequently tried to convince people not to follow him. He asked more questions than he answered. He created space for people to speak, to struggle, and to be changed, not through coercion or charisma, but through presence. He didn't set himself up as the only voice. He didn't build a hierarchy, he built a movement. And it makes me wonder, what if church was more like that? Not built on hierarchy, but dialogue. Not about one man delivering answers from a stage, but a circle of people asking better questions together. Sometimes I imagine church like that. Less performance and more participation. Less sit down and receive and more stand up and speak. Less scripted and more sacred. And I got a glimpse of that when I taught at a Quaker school. At first, I kind of really didn't get it, but then I experienced my first Quaker meeting. And something in me clicked because in those meetings, you'd sit in silence, and there's not really a quote unquote leader, there's not really a preacher, there's no sermon series or countdown timer, branded mugs in the lobby. You just wait and you listen. And if someone feels moved by the Spirit to speak, they speak, not to perform, not to control, just to offer. And then you wait again. It's the most stripped down, counterculture, sacred kind of gathering I'd ever seen. No pressure really to agree, no pressure to respond, just space. And that space did something to me. It reminded me that God, the divine, spirit, whatever, can speak through anyone. And that we've spent far too long building churches that pretend otherwise. Because the truth is, we don't need louder preachers. We need better listeners. We don't need bigger stages. I think we need deeper circles. We don't need one voice amplified. We need many voices honored. And I know it might sound idealistic or even naive, but after everything I've seen, I'd rather chase something small and sacred than keep propping up something big and broken. So, yeah, maybe we don't need to throw out church. Maybe we just need to start listening again, not just to the guy on stage, but to each other, and to God. So maybe the question we need to ask isn't just what went wrong. Maybe it's what were we trying to build in the first place? Because what happens when a church stops reflecting the Spirit of God and starts reflecting just one man's personality? What do we lose when that dialogue is replaced with hierarchy? What kind of faith are we actually practicing when our community starts to feel more like a fan club than a sacred circle? And maybe the harder question is, where have you seen this? Where have you felt this? And have there been moments, quiet, buried moments, when you realize you weren't following Jesus as much as you were following someone who talked about him really well? Because I know I have. But I still believe there's something worth saving. I still believe there's something sacred at the center. It just might mean letting go of the systems we've built around certainty, control, and personality, and finding our way back to something simpler, quieter, and more honest. And that's where I want to go next. Because with Easter just behind us, I've been thinking about something I've really never really heard talked about in church spaces. How sometimes we don't just idolize our pastors, we idolize Jesus. We make an idol out of the cross, not in a way that leads us to deeper love or compassion or mystery, but in a way that turns him into a symbol of power or control or exclusion. I've felt that in my church, and I've seen it in a whole lot of others too. And so that's what the next episode is going to be about. How we take even the most sacred things and twist them into tools of control, and maybe how we can untangle that too. So thank you for tuning into this episode of Clemens with a Z. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these honest, sometimes heavy, but always important conversations going. If you are a member, were a member, or know someone who's a part of the ICOC or the ICC or the RCW and would like to share your story about life in and out of the church, I'd love to hear from you. But also, if something from this episode hits home for you, if you've ever found yourself centering your faith around a pastor, a personality, or a system, and you're working your way through it, I'd love to hear your story too. Maybe it's time we talk about it together, out loud. You can reach me anytime at clemenswithaz@gmail.com or send me a DM on Instagram at the Clemenz with the Z podcast page. If this episode resonated with you, please take a second to rate, review, like, and subscribe. It helps more people find these conversations in this space. And as always, I'm just a channel, I ain't the source. If you'd like to support the podcast financially, you can find the link to the GoFundMe in the show notes or on Instagram. Or you can head over to clemenswithz.com and grab a sticker or something cool from the shop. Every little bit helps keep this going, and I'm so grateful for it. Until next time, stay honest, stay grounded, and keep growing. Peace.